I recognize Mr. Jordan from Ohio for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Ratcliffe, I think Dr. McCormick was on to the right question. It seems to me the fundamental question is why? Why did they lie to us? And why is it taking so long? You point this out in your testimony. Why is it taking so long for every government agency to admit what we all know? Because belief in a lab leak as the origin of, as the start of this, is not a conspiracy theory, is it, Mr. Ratcliffe?
No.
Why is it taking so long then? I mean, you knew that early on, right? If I look at you, you knew that you were confirmed, I think, in May of 2020, and you knew that within weeks that this thing came from a lab. In fact, you say that, I think, in your testimony. You say a lab leak is the only explanation, only credible explanation. If this were a trial, the preponderance of the evidence is all on the side of the lab leak. You knew that within weeks. So why did the government not tell us the truth?
Well, I think, you know, when you look at the intelligence community report that the Biden administration put out in October of 21, they acknowledge that China's refusal to cooperate, but the report in any way ignores what I think is the inescapable fact and reality that if the CCP had anything exculpatory, anything at all, anything that would be helpful to showing that no one was to blame for this, right, that this occurred naturally, that they would share that. And, you know, why not share data, samples, research, everything that tends to show that they had access to, that would tend to show that this was naturally occurring and tend to show that lab leak theory really was a conspiracy theory. But they didn't do that because they couldn't do that. And to me, that's why making an assessment with some level of confidence is something that should have been done a long time ago by the intelligence community. Yeah, we need to protect sources and methods. It's why Mike Pompeo and I labored over how much of this can we put out, hoping that it would drive the next administration coming in to declassify more information, which they haven't, and would drive congressional hearings into the origins of this, which it didn't.
Here's what gets me. So the Director of National Intelligence knew this thing came from a lab. The Secretary of State knew this thing came from a lab. Common sense tells you this thing came from a lab. And frankly, even the guys who called us names knew it came from a lab because we have their emails. We have their emails from the start. Mr. Gary says, I don't know how this happens in nature. It'd be easy to do in a lab. Mr. Anderson says, this is not consistent with evolutionary. Everyone knew at the get-go. You knew at the get-go. And yet, they tell us just the opposite. Why?
Well, you left out the top public health official, a virologist, Dr. Redfield.
Dr. Redfield knew. He's testified, yes.
Also testified. So you did. You had the top diplomat, the top of the intelligence community, the top public health official, all telling you with some confidence level that the most likely origin of this was a lab leak. And I think that, you know, unfortunately for political reasons and political narratives, it was difficult.
So did you talk with Dr. Fauci during this time frame when you get in May and over the next several months? Did you talk to Dr. Fauci anytime?
No.
Never spoke with Dr. Fauci?
No.
Do you find that strange when he's out saying something directly contrary to the Secretary of State, to the Director of National Intelligence, and to the top virologist, Dr. Redfield, that Dr. Fauci wouldn't talk with you?
Yeah, to be clear, there were folks within the coronavirus task force that were communicating, you know, medical and scientific information to the intelligence community, not me directly, but none of that information was frankly consistent with what we've talked about, what the intelligence showed. Again, some of those individuals, to include Dr. Fauci, were promoting the idea that this was natural origins, and notwithstanding you know, the language that was read, they were referring to it publicly as a conspiracy theory in certain conversations.
Dr. Collins called us conspiracy theorists if you believed in the lab as the origin. Tell me why do you think Fauci and Collins took that? I got my theory and I think I'm right, but I'd like to hear from the Director of National Intelligence what he thinks Fauci and Collins' motivation for sharing false information with the American people.
Well, I think the best evidence of that is their own conversations, which say that they didn't want unwarranted or unwanted, or I think the term was unwanted attention to the relationships that were taking place between Western virologists and those working within the Wuhan
You think
Institute of
maybe-
Virology and funding sources for some
Yeah.
of that research?
Our
into-
money to a lab in China that wasn't up to code, that was doing gain-of-function research, and that's where this thing came from. That's what they didn't want us to know. Do you agree with that, Mr. Ratcliffe?
I do agree with that.
That's important. Thank you. I yield back.
I'd now like to yield to Ranking Member Ruiz for a closing statement, if he would like